Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking all things decision making in coaching, professional judgment in coaching with Dr. Andy Abraham. Andy, good to see you. Welcome.
Yeah, likewise, Dan. Really good to see you again. Looking forward to this. Should be good fun.
Yeah, well, welcome back. You've been on the Sports Psych Show before, and I know a lot of listeners will know of you and your great work. But let's start with a brief introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you said, my name's Andy Abraham. I work at Leeds Beckett University, where I am what's known as the head of subject for sport coaching, which in old money we class as a head of department for sport coaching. That is sport coaching as an academic group, where we run here a degree in sport coaching, an MSc in sport coaching, an MSc in coach development. And we also run a professional doctorate in sport, which is a school-wide thing, but is heavily contributed to by us as a group because, funny enough, the professional doctorate talks about professionalism and judgment. So it sort of fits with where we perhaps why we have a connection with that. So I've been here since 2007. So 16 years. It will be 16 years come November, which has flown by. So that's my professional role. I also been a community rugby coach for the last 11 years, which has been a really interesting and useful insight. So whilst I'm a bit of a career academic, I do try and dabble in that. But as I would say to anyone that I think, and I don't believe in blowing your own trumpet, but equally I'll say what I think is I think I'm a very good coach developer. I think I'm an average coach, and that's simply because I think to be better at something, you have to be able to practice it a lot. And I've not been able to practice coaching a lot, but I've been able to practice being a coach developer a lot. So that's why I see myself being good in this one, but okay in that one. In addition to that, we've done lots of work with different governing bodies to support them in their coach development practices. We did a big project with the Football Association a few years ago, looking at working with all their coach developers. Again, that was a really insightful process to understand how NGBs and universities connect with each other, and that might come up as we talk as we go on, Dan. So hopefully that gives you some insight.
Yeah, no, it does. And I'm really interested to pinpoint in on something you said there and maybe to flesh and broaden it out a little bit. The difference between being a coach developer and a coach. Intellectually, I get that, but it's interesting that you'd say, and very honestly so, that, hey, look, I'm a better coach developer than I am a coach. And you said, well, reasoning being is that I work on developing coaches more so than I do coaching. So that, okay, I get that. But the interesting thing is I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily see a distinction between the two, would they? Can you broaden that out for us a little bit?
Well, yeah, two things, I suppose, in there, Dan, is firstly, I mean, obviously, we've interacted a lot, and there's been the things we've been talking about on Twitter around the who, what, how model. So we can take that who, what, how model. And I should add to that, it's not just who, what, how. There is understanding the context, understanding the process and practice, and understanding yourself as a person. So there's 6 elements, but the core ones, I suppose, you go, if you're working in this space, it's who you're coaching, what are you coaching, and how you're coaching it. So if I'm going to be good at something, I've got to know my who, I've got to know my what, and I've got to know my how. So I suppose I got into this game in my first job. If you go right back, it was initially being asked to work with Dave Collins on an effective coaching project with the LTA back in 1996. Mm-hmm. So I've got that's coming up for a horrible number of years, and it's
you're an experienced man, Andy. That's what it is.
Yes, yeah. So so I've got a lot of history in that space, and as a result, I co-wrote or led on the writing of what at the time was Scotland's very first 3-year coaching degree. Now, the people in Scotland would go, oh yeah, but we had this. But actually, the first 3-year start to finish coaching degree was one that we developed at Bell College when I worked there in 2002, I think it was. So I've been learning about the what of coach development for a long time. What is the curriculum? What is the skills? What's the knowledge that we want to create within a program to support people? And as a result, over the 27 years I've been doing this, I've learned a lot about working with adults, and I've learned a lot about how we do that based on all the reading, all the things I've written, and working with professionals over the last, like I say, 27 years. But equally, and this is probably the important bit for me, is if you look at judgment decision making, there was I can't remember the name of the person now, but I'll find it for you, Dan. But essentially, there was a piece written by Yates and Shearhart who quotes someone else who says, "Every judgment is a bet. No one ever makes a judgment knowing for sure what the outcome of that judgment will be. So every judgment's a bet." Whereas and that to me really resonates. I think that's a really good way of looking at things. But that's entirely in keeping with what Donald Shon wrote about in the 70s and 80s and 90s probably as well, which is everything's an experiment. So because everything's a bet, you're always testing a hypothesis as you go along. So you need to do lots and lots of bets and lots of hypotheses, lots and lots of experiments to start to understand how a process works. So I've been doing that for 27 years, full-time, I suppose, since I got my first full-time job in 1998, I think. So, that's a lot of experiments I've been doing for a long period of time, because I always like to try and challenge myself to come up with thinking of ways in which we can work with people. So when you compare that as a process that I've been through to 11 years as a community coach, probably coaching or thinking about working with kids in that space for maybe 3 to 4 hours a week, maybe a bit more, probably more over the last 5 years, I would imagine. The amount of experiments I've done is just far, far fewer. So it almost goes without saying that, of course, I should be better at the thing I've been doing lots of experiments on than the thing I've done less on. So yeah, so as a result, I don't know the kids as well as I probably want to. Rugby is a new sport to me. I still don't know rugby as well as I should do. I feel like I've always got good reasons for how I deliver, and I think I've got a good understanding of who I am as a person and the beliefs I have about that. So, which are transferable from coaching to coach development. And I'm still the same person, but yeah, I think hopefully that explains why I think I'm better at one than the other.
A couple of interesting quotes you gave us there. Every judgment is a bet. Everything is an experiment. And at the same time, what's ringing in my ears is the importance of expertise. You alluded to that quite a bit in what you were saying there, that when you do something a lot, then you get to know the who, the what, the how, and with expertise becomes probably, possibly better judgments and more successful experiments, probably. I think it's a neat segue onto what we want to specifically talk about today. And I think you've already started that, and that is an area that you have a great deal of expertise in, and that's something called professional judgment and decision making. I think we can all attest to the idea. I mean, I've been a golf coach before I became a qualified sports psychologist, and it's a decision-making process. When I stood there on the range with players or went out on the golf course with golfers, I'm watching them, I'm observing them, I'm interacting with them, asking questions, and it's a judgment for myself and a decision-making process as to where I'm potentially going to take them, and maybe even how much I'm going to involve them. And so you've been heavily involved in a line of literature, academic literature related to coaching, called professional judgment and decision making, because coaching is about judgment and decision making, isn't it? As you said, it's a bet, often an experiment, and you can skew it your way potentially through expertise. So there's my long-winded explanation, Andy, in order to introduce our topic today. Tell us a little bit. We're going to have people listening in, I know, who will say, well, I've never heard of professional judgment and decision making, PJDM, and this crops up on Twitter quite a bit, this acronym PJDM. Can you take us from the beginning, your involvement from the beginning, tell us what actually is PJDM?
Yeah, sure. So if I go right back to the beginning, my initial research was around this idea of declarative and procedural knowledge, which are two words which you will read. Some people will see it. Now, essentially what we've got is, from a simplistic point of view, procedural knowledge is what and how we do things. So there are procedures that we will follow that gives us our what and our how. The declarative is, if you like, what underpins that, which is the why. And the argument that, and this was work I was doing back with Dave Collins, like I said, back in the 90s, was what seemed to be fundamental is that people can do what and how, but if they don't understand why, it's very hard to reflect on something. So if you don't understand why you're doing something, it's then very hard to actually reflect on it, which has lots of implications for if you're working with novice coaches, for example, because what we know with ranked novices, rather than, and I need to be wary here, that you can take a 30-something or late 20-something adult and say they're a novice coach, but they're not really 100% novice because they might have already worked out that they should ask themselves some challenging questions. But if you take an 18-year-old, actually what you find is when you ask 18-year-olds to reflect is they generally become descriptive because they don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. So they will generally, if you look at coaching, what happens initially is people copy. So can you tell me a good drill? Yeah, there's a good drill. A drill is a piece of procedural knowledge. Here's what you can do and how you can do it. But it doesn't necessarily carry the why. So that's where the original work started, was what does this mean for if we want to examine practice? And we would talk a lot about the importance of understanding, but recognizing that actually you still need to know what you're doing and how you're doing it, to the extent that that has implications about, well, where do you start with the education of someone? Do you start with the why or do you start with the what and the how? And there's actually arguments to start in both places. But ultimately, what does someone want to do when they want to come do coaching? They want to get on with it.
Yep.
You know, it's a bit like when you get your PlayStation. What do you want to do? You just want to get on with it. What do I do? What do I do? And so it's the same thing as if you recognize people's motivations, well, let's give them, we wrote something and I put it in that link that I said about cooks and chefs. So there's an interesting, I think, analogy there, which is lots of people will have cookbooks. Cookbooks include recipes are procedures. They include what and how. Do this, now do this, now do this, now do this. Now, it's not unusual, therefore, that people would want that in coaching. But it doesn't necessarily mean you know why it does what it does. And when to me, a fascinating guy during the noughties and early 2010s was Heston Blumenthal, who talked about the science of how the tongue works, how the taste buds work, how the nose works, how different ingredients interact with each other. So he essentially got into biology and chemistry to better understand why things happen the way they do. And hey presto, what happens? He becomes more innovative and more creative because he knows why. And so it's that shift from going to be a cook to being a chef, which I think is one of the things we're doing, is the chefs, the best chefs are the ones, just like coaches, just like doctors, just like the ones who want to know, why does this happen the way it does? Because if I understand it, I perhaps have more control over it, and I'm now better informed to do some experiments with it. So Heston did, I say Heston like I know him, I don't know him at all. But so Mr. Blumenthal, he did that series where he tried to work out what's the best burger, what's the best spag bol. You go, these are just fairly basic things. Yet he's going around going, yeah, but what makes it the best? And he's creative, he's innovating. So that's where I started, was that idea of procedural to declarative. Hopefully I've explained that well enough before I move on to the next bit.
Yeah, no, you have. And I'll just reflect back. I'm kind of hearing the what, the how could be, as you say, a drill, an activity that's going on the pitch, whether it's rugby, football, or on the court, it's basketball. But why are you doing what you're doing is the declarative side of things. And that's a deeper dive here. And I'm assuming this is your entry point towards professional judgment, decision-making, PJDM.
Yeah.
Please carry on.
Exactly. So if we know that the why is important, and then, so I suppose we did that, and then and Dave, at the time, was working with a woman called Amanda in Martindale, her work's in sports psychology. So we were starting to explore the similar space at the same time. At the time, Amanda was working at Bell College, funny enough, and then went off to do a PhD with Dave. And I would very much suggest that readers go and dig out her work. It's fascinating stuff. But we're starting to look at, if we know that the why is important, but we also know that coaching at that point becomes more than just delivery. It becomes about what informs that delivery, which I suppose moved us into the space of the work of Daniel Kahneman and Gary Klein and a very famous paper they did together, Conditions for Intuitive Expertise, I think it's called. And it starts to look at, well, how do people actually use knowledge and how do they engage in judgments? So we essentially start to explore the judgment and decision-making space of the idea that some judgments seem to be slow and thoughtful, considered, critical, reflective, all those different things that we know happen. But also judgments seem to be fast, intuitive in the moment, which if you stand back from coaching, well, that sounds quite similar to plan, deliver, review. The slow bits is your planning, the faster bits is your delivery, and the slow bit becomes your reviewing. So you start to look at, so what happens though if the delivery doesn't match the plan? And how a coach is doing that? And that it brought us into how a good coach is doing that. And that brought us this idea of nested decision making, as in what seemed to be the case is the good coaches, expert coaches, whatever term you want to use, a decision made in a delivery moment, which people were aware of, might have been quick and intuitive, but it was ultimately nested back into what is it they're trying to do over a longer period of time. So the idea of nested decision making was that you would look at, and again, this was data driven by the coaches we work with, was, well, what am I trying to do over a period of time? So if I'm an Olympic coach, that's maybe a 4 to 6 year cycle. If I'm working in something which is slightly more tenuous, such as football, for example, where people, a long period of time might be a year, 18 months. But there tended to be a plan of what is it we're trying to do, and that would be what we would class as being a strategic level of what's the strategy we're working to here. How does that then play out? So if I've got 4 years, how does that play out over the next year? And people might be going, this sounds like macro, meso, micro periodization, but it's probably more than that. So what are the things which we're going to do this year which will work into the next year? So you can see that people are starting to lay out their long-term bets, and then they take a long-term bet and move it into a slightly shorter-term bet. So I'm trying to work out, it's almost like I'm trying to look into the future, because all judgments are made, as I was saying before the actual outcome of the judgment occurs. So everything is based on what we think might happen in the future. And then you take that year and you start to go, what does this look like for the next few weeks? So what we were finding was that good coaches who are making a decision in a moment could nest that back into, well, what's the overall strategy we're working towards? And that overall strategy also became a bit of a benchmark to think against when uncertainty occurred, which ultimately, of course, it's going to happen. If you coach, you're going to come across uncertainty. If you do anything, you're going to come across uncertainty because we live in an uncertain world and everything's a bet, all those sorts of things. So essentially, we were looking at how do these quick, naturalistic decisions nest themselves back into what we were classing at the time as longer-term, thoughtful, critical, classical decisions. Now, all I've done there is still talk about judgment and decision-making. You raised the idea of expertise, which is, if you like, the next really important bit, which is, if I am going to be making these judgments about what I'm thinking about, what I'd like us to achieve, I have to have some reason for making those. So going back to the declarative knowledge, what's my reasons why? And the suggestion is, and it's a very clear suggestion, which is expertise seems to help us be better at making these bets. So if I want to be better at something, I need to be more expert in it. So we've got judgment and decision making, and then you've got the professional bit. So where I suppose we went with that profession was there's some really nice work around why do we go with professional rather than expertise, judgment, decision making. And I think the issue for professionals it's not just about expertise. So you clearly need it, but if I was just read you out 5 benchmarks that David Card, and this was from 1999, and I've written about this on numerous occasions. He talks about 5 core things about what makes something a profession or professional. Professions provide an important public service. Well, I'd hope coaching would be able to do that. They involve a theoretically as well as practically grounded expertise. So it can't just be you sit in an ivory tower and pontificate. You've actually got to be able to see how this works. So coming back to, I might have my reasons why, but if I don't have my set of procedures that I've got in my, if you like, in my back pocket, which I can use, my procedural knowledge, then I probably haven't got that practically grounded expertise. They have a distinct ethical dimension, which calls for expression in the code of practice. That might well be an issue for coaching that has come up if we look at some of the reports that have been released recently. They require organisation and regulation. Coaching doesn't quite have that, as in some spaces and not others. Professional practitioners require a high degree of individual autonomy, independence of judgment for effective practice. And funny enough, if you were to follow what's going on in teaching at the moment, a lot of people are starting to talk about the deprofessionalization of teaching because of the loss of autonomy. So the professional bit wasn't just about the expertise, but the expertise was fundamental in it. But there are other issues around why we would talk about professional judgment and decision making rather than just expertise-based judgment and decision making. So hopefully that gives you an insight as to where we've gone with that.
Could you, thank you for unpacking all of that. Are you able to reflect upon your own rugby coaching with relation to what you've just described? How are you personally using your own research, professional judgment and decision making, PJDM, in your rugby practice? So you've unpacked what this is, and it's quite multi-dimensional and vast, and isn't hugely straightforward. So what does this look like at the coalface? What are you doing, or at least what are you considering, and what are you doing as a rugby coach when you think of PJDM?
Funny enough, what I'm doing is probably giving myself a very hard time, because I know, as I think I've said to you on the last time I was on, is that I think my biggest sources of stress when I coach, and the more I've done it, the more I have a huge amount of time and respect for people who go out and coach, it's hard. It's really hard. Because of the public nature of it, it's hard. And then funny enough, the more when I look at it, the more I know it's probably not as professional as I'd like it to be. And that's what causes me some, if you like, some stress about what it's like to coach, is because one of the things that you get into when you go with this is you see a shift, and I will come back to your question, I promise, to give you an example of this. Yeah. Is what we see when you take a novice and track them through, and this is some research which we really need to do to actually do the proper tracking, but there's lots of theories about what happens when people change at a cognitive and metacognitive level, and what that means is what people know and think about and how they choose to think about their thinking. So what we see is a move from coaching being there's a right and wrong answer through to, at the more expert professional level, is coaching is relative to the moment that you're in, and there are choices to be made. And when you make a choice in awareness of the choices you've chosen not to go with. So when you ask me about that, if I was to talk about it as being a coach developer, so we're just rewriting our coaching degree at the moment. As we do that, we are making choices between what we are going to do and what we're not going to do. And those choices will be deliberate about, well, we could do that, but we're going to do this instead. because there's lots of things you can do with doing a degree. So when you go back to me as a coach, which is one of the reasons why I'd say is that I think I'm a very good coach developer, because if you were to ask me, why have you not chosen to do that? I can explain to you why I've not chosen to do that. And also what would perhaps make me go back to that and re-examine it again if this thing doesn't work that we've chosen to do. So when I look at this from a coaching perspective, and why I don't think I am as good, is because I think I do know the choices. So, I have a Wednesday evening and I have a Sunday. So what makes it sort of semi-professional is that in terms of noting, let's just take, for example, picking a team. Now, rugby has helped with this enormously by saying that if you have everyone you take to a game must play half a game. So I think that's a wonderful rule, by the way, and I think lots of sports would do well to follow it. But when you look at trying to decide who starts, there's lots of things going through your head about, well, who are we playing? Who's been coming to training so knows what we're trying to do? Who hasn't played the last couple of weeks? Because actually we have a concept, and I'll come back to concepts in a bit, Dan, perhaps that might be worth exploring, which is we set out at the beginning of the year that by the end of the year, if people have made themselves available for games and come to training, by the end of the year, people should roughly have been able to have the same amount of rugby across a year. And even within that, we know that, and this comes back to knowing the who, that 4 of our players don't play at school. So we try to get them more game time than the other, because the rest of the guys on the team play at school. So we're starting to make judgments based on expertise of knowing who it is we've got, who we're playing against. But we make them, or I make them, on the basis of knowing that we've decided not to do something just as much as we decided what we are doing, if that hopefully makes some sense. So that's based on, going back to saying nested decision making. So we have a view about, by the end of the year, we would like to be in a position where everyone can get to the end of the year and goes, yeah, I've had a fair crack at the whip to play games this year based on how much I've made myself available at the weekends and so on. In terms of why I don't think it's as PJDM as I'd like, is I don't think I know rugby well enough as a sport, because I don't think I've got the time to invest in learning about it, to accurately, in my head, predict what I think we need to work on over a year's time. So in other words, create a rugby curriculum. If you had you had Mike Ashford on the other week, didn't you? But if you asked Mike to create a 3 or 4 year rugby curriculum, he could probably go away and say, I'll come back to you in a week's time, and I will give you something which and I would say on his behalf, it will be really good. I couldn't do that because I don't know rugby well enough. So I think part of what I do is I have some beliefs which are definitely informed by literature and research, which about giving players opportunity, about not worry about who the biggest players are, who the smaller players are, because that's based on when people are born in the year, and we try to make sure that we don't go down that route of just picking the biggest players. So there's who we do that I think we do pretty well, but not as well as I'd like to, because I don't know the players as well as I'd like to, because I only see them once or twice a week. The what is, it's okay, I'd like that to be better. But the how, again, if I'm looking at how do we set up practices? Generally speaking, if I'm seeing them once a week, I might introduce something new. So there'll be quite a bit of direct teaching with that. So demonstrations, instructions, I'll try and, if it's not raining, I might take my iPad with me and try and draw it out for them. Introduce it, but ultimately rugby at this time of year is cold and you want them moving. So I'd like doing if I can, scenario-based training, or we do game-based work, because I think it's important that people see where defenders are and all those sorts of things. The perception, connecting the perception with the action, but equally trying to get players to think about what they're trying to do, be intentional. So we talk quite a lot about intentions. So I'll try and draw this to a close, Dan. So I think my who is okay. I think my how is well thought out. I know why I'm doing it this way rather than a different way. So if I'm doing even small-based stuff with the how, it would be like the equivalent of rugby rondo, which I nicked off Russell Earnshaw, which was a good idea to me. It's 3-on-2s, 3-on-1s, 4-on-2s. Get the ball moving, and I'm listening. Are you breathing heavily? Because if you're not working hard enough. So I'm listening for those sorts of things. So those are very deliberate. My what is okay, but I think that could be far better. And I think if I was a professional rugby coach who really knew what I was doing, that curriculum would be really well mapped out for across a year. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense.
Let me reflect back some of the things I'm hearing here. Shorthand coaching is who, what, how, why.
Yeah.
Who am I coaching? What do I want to coach them? How am I going to coach them that? Why am I coaching in this way? It's interesting that you pinpoint for yourself on your coaching journey that who you feel that you're, the who side of things you're pretty competent around. The what you feel for you is heavily influenced, and maybe for everybody is heavily influenced by your expertise in your domain, whether that be rugby or golf or tennis or basketball. Why it feels like an entry point into coaching improvement lies in that why, that potentially listening to what you're saying, my cogs are turning, thinking that would it be fair is the wrong word here, could we possibly suggest that some coaches aren't asking themselves why enough? Why am I doing what I'm doing and how I'm doing it for the people, the people I'm coaching? And that actually posing the why often is an important part of a strong mediator of your coach development. The why, asking why, prompts you to explore further afield, to read more, to seek more avenues for knowledge. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of very good coaches. I mean, we come across them all the time, and because we talk about professional judgment decision making, but coaching is not a profession, which has big implications for it. Now, if you look at where different sports are, some sports are licensing, some sports are saying this is what you have to have. So, athletics, you need to be licensed. In rugby, typically there's an element of, if you're working in a more professional game, you should at least have what's now the England Rugby Advanced Coaching Awards, but they then have another one above that. Football, if you want to work in professional football, you now need, I believe, a minimum of a UEFA B, and probably quite quickly you need to be having your advanced youth license and UEFA A. So there is a professionalization going on that sports are requiring higher levels of qualification, but it is not a profession. And what I mean by that is professions are protected. So if you look in sports psychology is a profession. It's a protected title. You can't call, as you would know, you can't call yourself a sports psychologist unless you are connected either through the BPS or
HCPC.
Yeah, so the Health Professional Council, is it?
Healthcare Professional
Council. Similarly for the medic, similarly for dietitians, you can be a nutritionist, but you can't be a dietitian unless you're professionally regulated. and so on. So those are protected, and all of those would be saying that you're not going to get this title without having a great deal of knowledge and training and development and so on. So, but that doesn't stop people being curious. It doesn't stop just because coaching isn't a profession. It doesn't stop coaches being curious. But it's then what's supporting the development of that curiosity into a knowledge base which is impactful, which allows people to know more about why they are doing what they are doing. And we talked about this in a piece, again, it was in one of the links, the UKCCE level 4 report that we did. We talked about the difference between what someone wants and what someone needs. Because typically, and it is only typically, people might decide what they want, but not actually recognize there's things around that they're not aware of, as in that someone else might go, yeah, you might want that, but I think you need this. To support the creation, you said before about a mental model as something, a set of ideas which are connected with each other, which allows me to make sense of what's going on in front of me, to make sense of what it is we're trying to do over the long term, and to connect those things together. So when you talk about the who, the what, and the how, so if you take who and what, you're looking at athlete-centered curriculum. That's actually a really big ask for someone to start creating that. If you look at the connection between the what and the, that was the who and what. The what and the how is you start to look at what does this mean potentially for practice design. And so it's not just that I might know about, random practice or block practice or representative practice. All these different types of practice options are available to me. If I don't understand my what, I can't bring those things together to actually create a practice design which is truly going to enable me to achieve what I think I want to achieve. So I could put on a game, but not really know what that game's trying to achieve. And I've said this to on numerous occasions to Mark O'Sullivan, who I think I think he's got a lot of insight, Mark, about how football can be coached. But as I've kept saying to him, but Mark, your capacity to do that is based on your expertise in football as much as it's based on your expertise in ecological dynamics. As in, if you believe in emergence, which I do, I'm quite happy with the idea of skills emerging as an interaction with with a task and within the environment. I've got no problem with that. But if you're trying to design something to support emergence, you've at least got to have some sense in your head about what it is you think is going to emerge. And that's the skill, the thing that you want people to be better at. So just by way of example, as I've said to students on numerous occasions, I played football since I was probably 5 out in the street. I went to try and teach my son how to kick a rugby ball. Spent an hour and a half talking absolute nonsense to him. And I had in the back of my head when I'm teaching him this going, is this right? And I was genuinely saying asking myself the question, the curiosity, is this right? I don't know if this is right or not. But because I know what I know, I then went indoors and just went YouTube, place kicking, rugby, looked at it, stopped it frame by frame by frame by frame, and looked and gone, I literally have just talked utter cobblers to him for the last 90 minutes. And because I'd watched it, now I had in mind that, we were deliberately doing block practice because I wanted to build his confidence quickly. There was a reason for the practice. It's just that the content of the practice was rubbish. As in what I was telling him and the way I was setting up it wasn't all rubbish, but it was predominantly rubbish. I then did something else. I thought, right, now I've got a better understanding of this. So, for example, we know if we give too many internal cues to kids too early on, it can confuse them and they become almost robotic-like in terms of how they work. So I generally have a view of when working with a young person on a new skill, using my professional judgment, I know that I probably want it to emerge before I start instructing too much with it. Because if I start with instruction too early, it's at least in internal things, it's just going to just become robotic. So I might say, for example, now it might be, I'm going to put this ball, tee it up so it's already off the ground a little bit, so I know I'm now constraining this activity, so it's easy for you to get under the ball. And I'm going to ask you to run at that ball from an angle, but I want you to try and get the ball to go straight. And I'll try and manipulate that so that, because what I'm trying to do is, knowing what I know is that you want the ball the foot to come across the body because there's more power generated by that. So why am I saying this? It's because I went and thought, I don't know enough about my what. I thought I did, but because I didn't know my what, I couldn't set up a well-constrained practice because I didn't know what I was trying to constrain to do. So, that's at a really micro level. If you're then thinking, how do I do this for working with a group of, 13 or 14, or currently mine are 15, 16, how do I create a curriculum for people for a year and then set up a series of practices which will facilitate their growth and development over that year? That's a big task, and you need to know your stuff if you're going to do that. I feel like I've wandered off your question a little bit. Do you need to bring me back on task?
No, it's interesting. So let me throw this into the mix then. Professional judgment, decision making. I think this is an interesting conversation I'm having with you because you're a coaching academic, an academic with coaching and coach development, and by your own, you're a rugby coach. You coach rugby, but by your own admission, that's something that's very much on the side that you have good experience, but not an enormous amount of experience and not an enormous amount of rugby knowledge. So let me ask you this. You're coaching, as you said, they're 15, 16-year-olds. How does that play with you? And again, I think you've said a couple of things to the tune of this. 15, 16-year-olds, do you experience imposter syndrome here? Do you feel that from a professional judgment and decision-making perspective that you can make really good quality decisions and professional judgments or judgments around the who is 15, 16-year-olds, around the what and the how, given that your knowledge isn't where you'd like it to be with rugby?
I'm not so sure it's imposter syndrome as much as, well, perhaps it is. It's an awareness that I could be so much better at what I'm doing.
Okay.
So you might argue that's imposter, but I don't feel like I'm an imposter because I think, given it's a community setting, on the whole, do I think I've done a good job by those kids for the last 11 years? Kids for lads now, but I think, I think I've made a positive contribution to what they do, and so I don't feel like an imposter in that setting. But if someone said to me, Andy, do you want to get involved in this talent program? I'd probably look and going, yeah, if I'm going to do that, I definitely need to learn more about rugby because I think I know what I don't know in that situation. And I think part of that then gets into another issue around professionalism. So you're talking about imposter syndrome. Part of imposter syndrome is you're aware there's things that you don't know about, which is actually not a bad place to be in some ways, because it's probably what makes you quite curious, and it's probably the thing which will mean that you'll talk to people. And there's been this, I suppose, this critique or criticism that, when you've engaged on Twitter, I've followed with it, is this idea of, is it just subjective? Well, everything's subjective when you get into it on this basis. It's how do you make it less subjective is the question. And that comes back to the point of expertise. And it comes back to the why of, it's not just about one person, it's one person within a community. So by way of example, what I mean by that is when you read the work of Kahneman and Klein, this is my interpretation of what they said, but I think what they said is expertise is defined by the peer group. So if you work in a relatively weak peer group, then that's where the expertise will lie, because that's where the drive will come from. If you work in a stronger peer group, then the expertise gets driven along a bit, which is why, if you take something like law or like medicine, the established and inverted commas professions, and this doesn't belie the fact that there's some horrendous practice which has been found out, and those, as we all know, there's been some problems within that. But generally speaking, you probably accept that those professions and professionals within those professions make, on the whole, good informed judgments. And part of that is because of professionalization agenda, which says, going back to what Carr says, which is that they need organization and regulation. The regulation is about maintaining people's expertise. There's an expectation that you will engage with others to justify what you know. And part of the issue for coaching is you've got cooks and you've got chefs and you've got everything in between. When I did a presentation the other day with where I had a picture of, he was at the time 7 or 8-year-old son with a tray of cakes, and Claire Smith, the Michelin star chef. I said, if this was coaching, we would call both of those people a coach. Mm. And that's an issue that exists for coaching, is that what is it that's driving the expertise? So is everyone who's a coach engaging in PJDM? Probably not, because the professional bit requires a really high level of investment in learning. And this is why I'll come back to what I said before. What coaching does have is it often has access to some very clever people in other fields who choose to get engaged in coaching within a community. So a friend, a colleague, I suppose, Bill Taylor, will talk about, just because you're not classed as a professional does not mean you can't behave professionally. Mm-hmm. So you can behave ethically. So a core element of being in a profession is capacity to behave ethically. Mm-hmm. I still think that's something that needs to be explored a lot in coaching, because I think that's, if we look at the issues that have existed, it's often because that's not been a core and established part of coach development. We've done a lot around safeguarding, but there's a difference between safeguarding and ethical decision making. It's informed by it, but there's lots of other things which goes on with it. And it's part of the, there's a phrase in my head, be careful what you wish for. If we want coaching to be established as a profession, we need to be very clear about, well, who is the professional, and what does that mean for everyone else who isn't a professional who wants to engage in coaching? And that's a big question, I think, which would need to be addressed, because you don't want to end up destroying what's been a brilliant community process for, hundreds and thousands of years. Coaches have existed in some form or other for all that time. But if we want someone who is able to consistently engage in PJDM, you need a peer group who will really drive that process and to raise the game of people so it's not just about being curious, it's about having access, people with that curiosity having access to a setting, educational and peer-wise, which allows that curiosity to be connected to other things which might be important. And I'll finish off with this as an example for that, Dan, is that, part of the questions are, and it is a consistent question, is around information processing versus ECOD, and if you're ECOD, you can't have that, and all this sort of stuff. And I've seen, I think is it Tom Parry who said about that, you've got to stick with this theory, and I sit and go, well, if you go with who, what, how, self, context, it's almost like saying that it's got to cover everything, because skill acquisition is impacted, as you've been saying, it's impacted by the person, it's impacted by the context. it's impacted by a coach's beliefs. It's impacted by your understanding of the sport, and so on and so on and so on. So when you get into this, ethics is a core part of skill acquisition. Sociology is a core part of skill acquisition. Skill acquisition is a core part of knowing your performer. These things all link up with each other, which is why when you get into the idea of coaching as a relative occupation, things are relative to the context. And when you engage in that level of relativity, and not the physics kind, although I'm sure physicists will go, yeah, this is pretty much describing what we mean by that, is there's lots of, going back to what I said at the beginning, every judgment's a bet. And actually, the more you start to know, the more you start to see how many things can impact on your bet. So you eventually make a choice in awareness that you're choosing not to do other things. And it's one of the questions that Dave has offered as a core part of your sense check on that is, what have you chosen not to do, and what would cause you to go back and choose that if this process didn't work? Because you've not ditched something because it's rubbish. You've chosen not to do something because you think that one you've chosen is a better bet. But as we know, not all bets come off. So you might have to go back to a different thing at some point.
I'm a coach. I'm a coach who says, at the top of my hierarchy, my coaching lens, the hierarchy of my coaching lens, I engage in judgment and decision making, professional judgment and decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, for me, nothing is off the table. Apart from, let's get rid of the obvious, bullying, any kind of pernicious ism, sexism, racism, elitism, and so on and so forth. Those horrible things are off the table. Everything else is on this vast coaching table that I have. And I start my guidance in terms of what I'm going to turn to on this table, what I'm going to pick out from this table on any given day is, you've used that word, context. And we use this a lot when we do get into the Twitter conversations, for example. It's like, what is the context here? If somebody puts up a video of a bunch of kids kicking a ball against a wall, it's very easy to criticize it and say it's not very dynamic, and what they're doing isn't necessarily going to translate itself onto the pitch when they've got 10 teammates and 11 opponents against them. But we don't know what the context is. How old are they? Are they in a professional academy? What's the curriculum that they're immersed in? What's the wider socio-cultural context here? So context matters in terms of, that's going to mediate what we're going to orient to on our coaching table. But my point of using this kind of pictorial analogy of a table with everything on it is, what I'm hearing you say is, really there's nothing off the table. If we see a basketball player, again, similar to the ball wall in soccer, we can have a basketball player who's throwing a basketball at the hoop for a couple of hours, and some coaches might go, well, yeah, but that's not immersed in the game, and it needs to be within the game, and he needs more players around, more cues and clues and triggers, which may be a fair point depending on context. But you're saying in professional judgment, decision making, well, hang on, hold on, what is the context here? And what is this? Well, what is this person's why? What is this coach's why? We need to know context. We need to know why. Where this could go wrong is if, let's say, we're watching a clip of coaching and there's a bunch of kids who are queuing and not doing much. By queuing, I mean they're waiting in line to have a kick of a ball. And, we may ask questions there. We might ask questions around, is this useful? Is this enjoyable? And so on and so forth. But even then, Andy, you're saying, well, hang on, let's still give the benefit of the doubt. We can't just take this out of context. Essentially, there's no bad coaching. there's just coaching maybe with poorer decisions as a consequence of fewer mental models around different ideas and different processes and different practices.
Yeah, it's exactly, and it's why when if someone chooses to post a video, what you're seeing in that video is an expression of their procedural knowledge. What you're not getting is the judgments which led to that procedural knowledge being enacted. In other words, what's your why? What's your declarative reasons for this? So without that, it becomes I'd look and go, so it becomes a fruitless exercise to critique before you've asked them why. So, and to be honest, it's very hard to ask someone why on Twitter anyway, because it just don't have the, you'd have to have thread after thread after thread after thread, and it's not the best medium to do that on. Clearly, it's not. So, I suppose now, does it mean that you look at, if you go to YouTube, and I've done this. I go to YouTube, type in "good game for whatever," and I look at it and go, right, I've now accessed someone else's recipe. I can just copy that recipe, procedural knowledge, or I can start to think about, well, why would that work for me? Why might it not work for me? So you can start to unpack it a little bit. You can tweak it. So to me, that's a stage as you might go on to. But coming back to your analogy of everything's on the table, you choose to do something, but there's other choices which are sat there, which you choose not to do.
Yeah.
Or you're not aware of it, and therefore the choice you've made is the only choice that's open to you, which then you'd look and go, well, if you want to be someone who engages in PJDM, there's a professional development need there for you, but it's not going to be answered quickly. This is a long road that you're going to get into. Even to the extent, one of the things we've just been working with a country's governing body, and one of the things I've suggested to them is they might want to look at a professional competence along the lines of, you might learn something which you might not use for a while, which is not that dissimilar. One of my neighbour's daughters is doing medicine at the moment, and I was having a conversation with her about the role of exams. And she's saying, yeah, but we just have to know this. And I said, but do you ever use it? Well, not yet, but we have to know it. And that's a readily accepted idea within medicine. And medicine has played around with problem-based learning and realised actually there's not much point doing problem-based learning until people have got the tools to A, identify the problem, B, solve the problem. So sometimes you do just have to put the hard yards in of learning some ideas, almost in the acceptance that you might not use it for a while. And that, to me, is part of the idea of the professionalization of coaching, is that there may be things that at the moment we just need to open your eyes to things that you might not need, that you need to know, but you might not use yet, which isn't great. There is a problem with that, but this is the world you might need to get into. So your idea of the table of lots of things on there, the novice probably doesn't even see lots of things. They just see a drill and just goes and gets it and goes, right, I'm going to do that, without being aware of all the other things which are going on. And that comes right back to where we were in the 90s. We're going, part of the problem for coach education at that time was it taught procedures and not declarative. It taught what and how without necessarily getting into the why. And then when you look at the resources that NGBs have to do that, which is the biggest constraint on resources, time, clearly. I know where we can get 18-year-olds to in 3 years on a 3-year degree. And it's at the beginning of the journey. We get people, I think, the better ones, the ones who've engaged in the program, you go, yeah, they're good to go and work with a group of young people, and they'll do you a good job. But they'll need quite a lot of support and supervision in the workplace. Not that different from when you send a new teacher into a classroom, is that there'll be a mentor and so on to support, because they're just at the beginning of the journey almost. But that's after a 3-year program. So I think the capacity to engage in PJDM requires such an awful lot of investment in time and learning, and accepting the idea of curiosity is being crucial. Now, if I was to just pause on that bit, Dan, I would say, well, there's an element with this which then goes, if you can't put that level of investment in, are you saying everyone else is just doomed to be not very good? And that definitely isn't what I would say. So I would pause at that point and then start talking about the role of rules and concepts, which I think can drive coaching practice. I don't know if you want me to stop at that point and then.
Yeah, no, well, please tell me about rules and concepts.
Okay, so far I've talked about slow and fast decision making. What these guys, so that was the Kahneman idea of think fast, think slow. So there's slow thinking, which should inform your fast thinking. Your fast thinking should be reflected on to inform your slow thinking, and it should be, a plan, deliver, review sort of process. What Yates and Shearhart, and actually if you go back to Anderson, with Proceedings with Clarity, talk about is that what's this middle ground where what gives us the route into solving problems? Because that's what, coaching's a lot about, solving problems of, well, how do I keep kids turning up? How do I help them be engaged? How can I encourage them to take more ownership? These are the classic questions that coaches face. What we know within that space is that better coaches will spend more time on the problem than novice coaches will. Novice coaches just want to answer it. Well, so for example, how do I keep kids engaged? Right, well, we just need to make the games more fun. You think, okay, might be more to it than that. But actually what you hear there is a rule. It's a concept that they will follow. And actually, if you look at the way which most people, all people in some way or other solve problems, that they'll often start with a rule which then leads on to something else. And when I say rule, that can be a concept or a conception. They all mean roughly the same thing. And you go, well, okay, Andy, give us an example of a concept. So a broad concept might be make it fun. Another concept might be ask the kids what they want. Another concept might be use small-sided games. Another concept might be a link to small-sided games is divide and conquer, and so on. And so when you start to look at it, there are a set of concepts which gives us an access to the problem space, which allow people to experiment. They might not have all the underpinning declarative to really understand what they're seeing and how what they're getting into, but it's that middle bit between the thinking slow and thinking fast. Is a good concept can help me think deeply, or it can also help me try and answer something quite quickly. So, for example, when we did the chapter, myself and Dave did the chapter on skill development, this was the original toolbox we did. So we did essentially a skill acquisition toolbox, but we offered 3 rules, which is make it personally relevant, promote player understanding, for short-term results, make it mentally easier, for longer-term results, make it mentally more challenging. Those were the 3 rules we offered for someone working in the skill acquisition space. And you might go, well, okay, how do I make something more difficult? Well, you go to the toolbox and you get into more game-like random practice with greater levels of variability. And that toolbox was originally written for tennis, so it makes perhaps more sense in a tennis space. Then you might engage in a more game-like activity where, as a coach, you would deliberately return the ball to forehand and backhand, and you drop it short and you drop it long, to deliberately try and manipulate your participant, your player, to have to move around the court and use different strokes. That would be mentally more challenging for that player. You might see more mistakes. But equally, if you then align that with, look, today I'm going to do this with you for these reasons, as in promote player understanding. So they recognize today's going to be a tough day. There might be mistakes, but we're doing it for these reasons. Which, by the way, because I've now given you those reasons, you can go away and reflect on some of those reasons to think about what you might want to do next time you come in, or just by way of example, what you might want to do if you're on your own, you've got a house with a wall, you might just want to go and hit the ball against that wall a bit. Now I've got lots of reasons why doing what looks like a closed practice with hitting a ball against the wall might be quite useful. And that's personally relevant to you based on what I know about you as in terms of a player, about what you'd like to do. So I think there's elements that we can do in terms of that for the who, the what, and the how. So for the who, a concept might be if you can engage the players in deciding what they want to do, that's called giving them some autonomy. That links nicely to the self-determination theory. If you're a sport, you might look at, well, what are the core concepts of, in hockey, hitting a lofted pass? Now, we know that people do it different ways, et cetera, but what are the core concepts that I can work with as a hockey coach in terms of the sorts of things that I might want to look out for, which would allow me to make sure that if I can see someone really struggling with this, I've actually got some way of helping them solve that problem. If you've got concepts in the who, the what, and the how, you're not giving them deep declarative, but you are giving them the space and the options with which they can start to solve the problems that they see in front of them. So to me, that's what you can do to support coaches, which is to work on the concepts, which then, if they want to go away and read and learn more, they've got an entry space into which they can do with that.
What was going on in my mind there? Because I was picking a potential scenario that I'd like to reflect back at you, and hopefully I've thought about this accurately and heard you correctly. So I'm thinking, it's a random example, Andy, but I'm thinking penalty kicks, right? And I'm kind of thinking, I mean, there was an interesting, I can't remember which team it was in the World Cup recently, and it may have been Spain, where they talked about practicing 1,000 penalty kicks or something like that. And apologies to Spain and the Spanish head coach if it wasn't, but which I think is really interesting, a really interesting approach, because it feels like though that's a concept that you'd use in that scenario with 16-year-olds if you wanted to help them improve their penalty kick. So let's just we want to help players improve their penalty kicks under pressure, and let's look at the difference between doing that with 16-year-olds and doing that with, let's say, an international team where penalty kicks is quite pertinent. With 16-year-olds, what you might do, and so I'm talking out loud here, I've listened to what you say, I might borrow from the concept of scaffolding and go, okay, let's remove the goalkeeper for 16-year-olds because we want them, and maybe this can go to our next concept of building a basic penalty routine. We're going to remove the goalkeeper and we want a player to pick a small target in the goal and just have one technical cue that they're going to use, and we're going to practice that way. Then maybe we introduce the goalkeeper and we practice that way, and we might have a small competition there. Whereas at international level, what we might do the same, but we probably won't start there because they're professionals. So I'll immediately go to the concept of routines again, but something more advanced. So I might do it from the halfway line, where penalties tend to start in a shootout at the end of the game. So we'll work on the walk-up. That's where the routine will start. So we're working on a concept of a more in-depth routine. And then we might add in some consequences. They might be financial consequences to ramp up the volume of pressure. We can probably do that with international footballers. We're not going to do that with 16-year-olds, but we're going to do it with international footballers. So I'm drawing on different I'm drawing on different concepts, using them differently in a different landscape depending on who I'm coaching. My mental models are landing on those ideas. I could probably think of more if I had more time, but that was my fast thinking there. So am I hearing you correctly? And is that a good example of kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. So interestingly, as you're saying that, I'm writing down some of the things you're saying,
Yep.
and I'm hearing rules, which is, if you were sharing that idea with a relatively, or a coach who's wanting to know, look, Dan, how do I do this better? And now I could hear your rules. There were rules, some of them which were more specific than others. So you'd said, for example, for the time being, just pick 1 point, remove the goalkeeper. But then you had something which was a bit broader, which said you might want to layer in, want to have some consequence in there. So actually, as you listen to people, and this is one of the things that I think people who listen to podcasts should try and do to make sense of a podcast is, what are the rules which are coming? And if you're a qualitative research, you start to talk about doing a thematic analysis. But what I'm listening, because I suppose I've got more expertise in this area, what I'm hearing you talk about as a broader rule, which is layered representativeness.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're keeping now layered representativeness, and I'd also talk about, you start off with relatively less mentally challenging to relatively more mentally challenging.
Yes. Yes.
So I can hear two rules which are coming out there, which is keep it representative, but think about the demand this is playing on. This is having on the performer. And I'm sure you would then go, well, if you're working with a team, you'd be going, right, okay, who are the people? We all think people can shoot, but actually we all know, if you played football, you know that there's some people who can shoot a hell of a lot better than others. So my guess would be well, how do I individualize this? You might go, well, who can place a ball where they want it? And who are the people who actually, when you put a bit of pressure on them, they start to fall to pieces a little bit, because we might have an intervention for them and an intervention for them. And this is why I think part of if you're going back to the idea of expertise is defined by the peer group. If you don't have a peer group, you can't ask these questions of each other. Go, well, Dan, you come along to me and say, Andy, I've got these ideas for penalty kicks. I've got some thoughts. I'll share them with you, and we can perhaps bounce them backwards and forwards between us. I've got some level of expertise. You've got some level of expertise. And we start to drive each other's practice a little bit. But what I think we're listening for is actually people's rules that they're following, and trying to go, well, what about, what if? And you start to ask these, why would you do that? You start to ask those questions. That to me is really important. But coming back to so that as a driving coach is really important. But the other thing I would say is, in terms of people listening to podcasts, is what are the rules that you're hearing that you can take? So you're not copying the actual recipe, you're copying the rules which might lead to the recipe without necessarily understanding why they think like that. And the reason why I say that is going back to Anderson's work, which is the declarative procedural. Anderson talks about is, when you get to procedural, it goes one of two ways. It can either become very specific procedural knowledge, or what he classed as being broad rules-based procedural knowledge. So you almost start to collapse the rules that you use into a concept, or you just create a very specific answer. So we gave this example in the paper we did in '98, which is, if you ask someone what's 3 times 9, they can give you the answer going, it's 27. That's a specific piece of procedural knowledge. But you might go, but what rules did you follow to get to that? Well, I did. Actually, I just now know 3 times 9 is 27. But actually, what I did originally was I would split it down into 9 plus 9 plus 9. So I'd see it as being an addition. And you start to get the rules that people follow. Hopefully that idea makes sense.
It does. And Andy, I say this and I'm mindful of your time, and we'll bring things to a close in a second. It's been a fantastic conversation. What you made me think of there was that important in sports psychology, our involvement in organisations, with teams, at clubs, with coaching staff, is that the narrative tends to be very much drawn into we work with and through coaches. Of course, we can work individually with players, and we should do, but a lot of the work we should potentially be doing with and through coaches, and that tends to be a very, very sticky narrative, and an important one. And I agree with it. I don't disagree with it, but I think, when we're talking about rules and concepts, and essentially we're coming back to knowledge base, I'm always standing there thinking, scratching my head and going, yeah, but you know what? When I, let's say, engage a player in, the psychology of taking a penalty, which is something I have a degree of knowledge about, because having been a golfer, having been lead site for England Golf, having worked with countless golfers, you are constantly helping players work on essentially dead ball deliveries, because that's what golf is. It's always a dead ball. And so routine, the nuances and complexities of routines, you can go quite deep into it. And so I've got a lot of ideas here. Whether they're effective and efficacious ideas is not for me to say, but I like to think they are. But the point being, I can go in a lot of directions.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of directions. It's like if you ask a London cab driver to take you from, I don't know, Paddington to Victoria. I'm guessing that cab driver could say, well, you know what, I can take you in 50 different directions, and it might depend on the traffic that's building at the time.
Yeah.
And this is the challenge you've got, let's say, as a sports psychologist, when it's working with and through coaches, is I can give one direction, and maybe I can give two, maybe I can give three, based on the knowledge that they've already got, the tool, the concepts, the rules, the tools that they've already got. But I can't give 10 or 15 or 20. And when you sit down with a player and you're going to work on a part of their game, or you're part of their thinking or values, or whatever it beliefs or whatever it might be, you can go in so many different directions. And my point to this is that that's what you're dealing with every day as a sports psychologist when you're working with and through coaches, is you can't give 10, 20, 30, 40 different ways of doing something, which ultimately you can engage in yourself. Rules, concepts, tools are so important. And it's, I think the same last thing to say here, Andy, is that I think it's a little bit like when I speak with coaches who are very insistent on self-regulation. Mental skills, that's all very nice, but I just want to design a game that's going to mentally challenge the player, and then I can give them the opportunity to self-regulate, and I can guide them through that. That's very nice, but as you said, there's a whole bunch of tools left on the table that you're not actually picking up and utilizing there. And that's where people like myself and people like myself can become very frustrated with the idea of, there's this one idea of self-regulation, and that fits all. It's like, hang on a minute, that's not necessarily true, or necessarily optimal. Anyway, that's my ramble to finish us off there.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes. We come back to your original question, Dan, of what is PJDM. And I suppose I would conclude by saying everyone is, and we haven't even talked about the role of tacit knowledge in this, as in the judgments we make without even realizing we're doing it. But which is actually, if you look at the work that Mike's done in theories, espoused theories versus theories in use, as in we think we're going to do something, and then you go and do something, and you don't do anything of what you thought. And it's then that's part of the interesting is connect. Well, why are you not doing what you thought you were going to do? And why are you doing what you are doing? Which then links you back into beliefs and all sorts of different things. But that's probably for a different day. But for me, the coming back to the PJDM is everyone engages in JDM. Everyone's making judgments and decisions as we go along. It's inevitable. What raises the bar, if you like, for me is going back to Carr's ideas of, fundamentally there's a level of expertise which is required. And some of that expertise, so when I say about you need to know about process and practice, to me, understanding the role of judgment decision making is understanding process and practice. So if I want to be better at that, and a rule, so going back to a concept, I really like the concept of expertise is defined by the peer group. So because there isn't a right answer, there is a series of answers which you will eventually want someone to come up with an answer. But that answer's got to be justifiable. If you're working in that high level professional field, and that could be a high level professional field working with 8-year-olds, or it could be working with 25-year-olds. We are asking people to engage in judgments and decisions. The professional bit is, well, what are the reasons why you're doing that, and what would cause you to pick something else, and how have you arrived at that decision, and why have you arrived at that decision? And I think part of the issue for coaching has generally been is that people don't talk to each other very much, and actually they should talk to each other far more, because that's the peer group. That's the group which is going to challenge you in terms of going, well, what would you do to make that different? How would you change that? And it's fine for a peer group to go, have you got a good drill for? Because there's nothing wrong with asking that question. Is there a game you can give me which would be really good for this? As long as that, in that circumstance, you go, well, I have, but this is why I designed it like to, what would you do to change it? So, because sometimes it feels like you're saying you can't go and copy someone. Of course you can go and copy someone, but the professional bit would be going, but why is it working for you, and what would I do to change it, and so on. So it's fine to go and pick someone else's practically grounded expertise to make your own. But then, well, why is that? So copying is fine, but that. So I suppose what to finish on the idea of the P bit is it's the bit which raises the bar and gives you the reasons behind why you're doing what you're doing. And for those who say, well, that just makes it subjective. Well, yeah, all judgments are subjective to some extent, because we don't know for sure that the decision will lead to the expected outcome. We hope that it will, and we hope that expertise increases that likelihood, but it's never guaranteed. And it's one of the reasons why when I speak to coaches and say, when you have a journalist who questions your decisions and says, time will tell whether it's the right decision. Well, coaches don't have that luxury. They have to make that judgment not knowing what the outcome of that judgment will be, especially when you're playing in a competitive game where someone's trying to outdo you. Because if you outdo them, if you follow that logic, you're saying, well, you've just disproved their judgments. If they beat you, they just disprove your judgments. And you go, no, neither of those is true. It's just that their judgment and luck has led to a circumstance which was not ever fully in your control. So if we've got people who talk to each other more, and this is why I do quite like Twitter, is people asking questions, but are we asking questions with a desire to understand why someone thinks that, or are we asking questions to try and prove why someone's wrong? And that to me is a bit of a nuance within that. Hopefully that's of help.
No, absolutely. Really interesting conversation, Andy. I can't thank you enough for that. How can people get in contact? How can they find you, follow you, and if you'd like to be contacted, how can they get in touch?
My university email is publicly available, so so that's just a.k.abraham@leedsbeckett.ac.uk. And as I'm speaking, I'm just clicking on my Twitter profile because I can never remember what my Twitter address is, which is @AndrewAbraham11. So they can follow me on Twitter. And when I reply to you, I think pretty much all of the work that I have had published is on ResearchGate. If people wanted to go and click on that, it's all available there. And that's true for most people as well these days. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Brilliant. Andy, thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.